As we've seen in the past, I always like to start off with this same verse, Psalms 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. It's a great verse to describe what glory that creation offers in the evidence of God and his power and his design, his intelligence. It's mind-blowing. We think of those pictures that we've looked at earlier in our series of the galaxies and just the little piece of the night sky and how much is out there. It's just mind-boggling. And then, just kind of reminiscing the things that we've talked about, but we talked about the cause and effect and the idea that the cause of all these have to be greater than the effect, which means the cause of all these galaxies, all these stars, just innumerable, and the billions and billions and billions that we see, and all the wonderful structure and mechanism and complicated, beautiful symmetry to life. Symbiotic relationships amongst organisms, all these things, God is greater than all of that because he has to be the cause. It's just amazing the things that we've seen in this lesson and what it says about our Father. As we have gone through this series, we've talked about evolution broken down into parts, looking at the evidences and determining what is true and what is false. We've looked at the theological arguments for the existence of God, and we are currently discussing common points of debate, things that you will see coming from the opposition when you are discussing the origin of life, the origin of all things, where we are promoting the faith that comes through the scriptures in God. Others are promoting a false idea of a natural, random causation to the universe. Would remind you to please leave your questions and comments and requests for clarification. And as the last lesson, as time permits in the study, I will review those questions and have a class on those answers. We are moving on tonight. Our next point of debate, we've talked about time, we've talked about the flood, and we've talked about, we talked about the hydroplate theory. Anyway, we're moving on tonight. Our point of debate is entropy. Entropy is one of the law of thermodynamics, the second law, in fact, that states that matter and energy tend towards a disorder. Entropy is where everything tends to disorder. As a very basic way to think about this, if you were to put food coloring in a warm glass of water, you don't have to stir it. Over time, you'll see that color will dissipate through the fluid. Well, that's because of entropy. Things tend to disorder. As things move around and bump into each other, and the forces that cause things to move and to interact, they tend to dissipate, to spread out, to disorganize. The natural process is to break down, is to deteriorate, is to die eventually. That's the natural order. We see everything obeying this law of breaking down over time. Yet, evolution claims to have the opposite effect. Things tend to order and greater complexity and greater functionality over time. By what means? By energy, by randomness. Going into that argument, the creation will say randomness cannot create. Randomness destroys. It dissipates. It breaks down. It doesn't make things more complicated. It doesn't increase function. It's not a creative process. The evolutionists will say, correctly by the way, that randomness and energy mixed with a mechanism that organizes it can produce something more complex. There can be a creative process when you have random energy, but being used, being harnessed by some type of mechanism. That is true. And we see that as an example in chlorophyll and plants. The sun is radiation, heat is a form of radiation, the light, all these things, that's energy. Radiation, you can think of radiation and energy being relatively synonymous. Energy by itself is destructive. If you leave a car out in the sun, that sun will destroy your paint job eventually. It it breaks things down. The energy breaks things down, it destroys eventually. However, in the case of plants, it has mechanism, those chlorophyll, that can harness that energy from the sun and nutrients that it has brought from the soil and from water, and it can create, it can develop, it can grow, it can produce fruits. So with the right mechanism to harness that energy, yes, you can take random energy, harness it with a mechanism, and create something. But there's a problem still. Where did the mechanism come from? The mechanism itself would have to have a mechanism to create it, because creation cannot come from random energy by itself. There has to be something to organize it. There has to be something to harness it. So the mechanism that would be used to create must have a mechanism to have created it, and that mechanism, so on and so forth. We have another one of those eternal regressions, that illogical concept of eternal regressions, going back and back and back with no end. You don't do that, not with a natural process. It doesn't work. Another point of debate, dinosaurs. This is a fun one, especially for like VBS and things like that. I enjoy when we've had VBSs in the past, especially when it talks about creation. I like to get involved and do some little science experiments with creation, like the strata we talked about before and things. We do dino drawings on the outside of the building. But evolutionists use dinosaurs as a way to even pick fun at those who believe in God and creation and the Bible. It says that, don't we know that dinosaurs predate man? I said, this isn't the Flintstones we're talking about here. Dinosaurs lived millions of years before man, right? And then they will mock, did Noah bring dinosaurs on the ark? And of course, if you've seen movies like Jurassic Park, the first Jurassic Park, an iconic scene when they see the first dinosaurs, you see the brontosaurus walking by the Jeep. Certainly you would say, well, you can't fit, two of those on that boat. And I don't care how big that boat is, that's not going to fit two of those on the boat. So there might be some logistical problems there. So did Noah bring dinosaurs on the boat? So what are our responses to these accusations or questions? Well, first, let's tackle the idea, did dinosaurs really predate man? According to the Bible, in the days of creation, if you take those as 24-hour literal days, then the creation of dinosaurs, including all animals, or in addition to all animals, being created very close in relation to man, would that mean that we did not coexist at one point? And they don't exist now, right? Well, there's some things that are very dinosaur-like that exist now. If you've seen crocodiles and alligators, one might be able to say that those are forms of dinosaurs, great lizards. The term dinosaur hasn't existed that long. The discovery of dinosaur bones, really, in the scheme of civilization, has not existed that long. We only recently have, in the course of human civilization, have become advanced enough to have the luxury to dig around in the dirt for no good reason other than to find things and see what, they could have been. Mostly our civilization has been very consumed with finding food and creating structure, civilization, homes, shelters, things like that. Most of human civilization, fighting wars, possession of land, things like that, but not so much about digging in the dirt. So the discovery of dinosaur bones and putting all that together, modern archaeology, that's relatively recent. The term dinosaur is relatively recent. So how would someone have even described things before the term dinosaur came along? Well, there's been a lot of descriptions of great lizards, great animals that don't seem to exist today. We don't see them, the descriptions that we have. Well, of course, a lot of this is just thrown up as mythologies. There's a lot of mythologies out there of great beasts. But certainly those were just fairy tales to scare the children at nighttime, right? So there's some other things other than just these legends, but we have all these cultural representations of dragons. Now, dragon was a term that has existed for quite a while, way before dinosaurs. I would propose that a lot of times when they said dragons, they weren't talking about flying, fire-breathing things that we think about today. They're talking about great lizards. There's other terms that's been used to define these large beasts, great lizards, in the past. In Job chapter 14, we read about Leviathan. Job chapter 40, we read about Behemoth. Both of these, the descriptions sound very much like what we think of as great beasts, giant lizards, what we might consider dinosaurs. And all these different cultures, everywhere you read cultures of these dragons, these beasts. You think of Beowulf, and you think about the Chinese calendar. Why would that was developed a long time ago, right? So why would the Chinese have put 11 real animals and one fictitious animal on the Chinese calendar? We had the dragon. Perhaps at one time that was considered to be 12 actual animals, right? Real animals that they knew of and could see and had record of. We also see some other interesting things. There have been these clay figures found that very much look like the depiction of dinosaurs. What would they have even known what dinosaurs looked like before archaeology? Before they were digging up dinosaur bones and putting them together, how would they even know what to carve in the rock? In these pictures down to the bottom left, we have cave drawings and carvings, things that look a lot like dinosaurs. Right? One in the middle looks kind of like a brontosaurus, right? Definitely great beasts of some kind that don't fit another description. Maybe it's not a dinosaur, maybe it's something else, but it's certainly something that we don't have today because it's awful big in scale. You have footprints alongside, human footprints alongside dinosaur footprints. The bottom right, you have a picture of a dinosaur footprint right through the middle of a human footprint. Now, there have been claims that some of these have been staged. I wouldn't try to guarantee anything as far as the legitimacy, but there are a lot of things that point to the possibility outside of the Bible that there was some coexistence of man and dinosaur. There's a lot of things that pop up. Now, perhaps some of these may be staged. Of course, we talked about transitional forms. There were plenty of those that were staged. Perhaps that could be the case here. Anytime you present evidence that is contrary to the general status quo, there's going to be pushback, and there's going to be theories and conspiracy theories and things like that. So I'm not claiming to be an expert on these things, but these are things that we have seen. Real or not, we see a lot of different things that point to the idea that perhaps, yes, there was coexistence. And the biggest reason to believe that there was a coexistence is the fact that the Bible talks about it, like we said in Job, that the days of creation. And like we said before, if we have to decide between science that's kind of, maybe it's a little sketchy, and the Bible, we'll stick with the Bible. If we're not sure, we have some evidence, but it may or may not be a hoax, stick with the Bible. It's more likely to be correct. It's been more proven. It's been more, it has defended itself longer and against more attacks. It has a better foundation for our faith than the comings and goings of what we may discover, human intellect and the ability to reason. So dinosaurs, I do believe that this suggests that we did, according to the Bible and some of the things that we've seen, these evidences, we did coexist. Well, how about the ark? Did Noah bring dinosaurs on the ark? Well, you would imagine that, in the beginning, the creation was described in ways of perfection and that was good, very good, according to God. Perhaps that lived more harmoniously with one another. But moving away from creation and towards the time of Job, we find that things have become more and more corrupted, and it talks about all flesh being corrupted, even talking about animals being corrupted. Perhaps over time, things might have developed a taste for one another. Things became more aggressive. Things became more of a menace to humans who have developed and have innovations and now can hunt and can trap and using their brains to concoct ways to eliminating these menaces. Now, a lot of these old legends of dragons are about people defeating the dragon, right? There's something in the village that's eating the sheep or burning up the children, and we need to destroy it because it's a menace. And most of all these different verbal passing down of these legends and these quote-unquote mythologies talk about even, I mentioned Beowulf, that was the Epic of Gilgamesh, and some of the Sumerian writings talk about this as well. you would imagine that if something is a menace, well, you might want to get rid of it. So I imagine that a lot of these animals were hunted because of the menace that they would have imposed. Of course, going towards the time of Noah, all flesh being corrupted, we could see that perhaps the harmonious nature of the Garden of Eden did not last, and because of that, there was strife amongst animals, between humans and animals. And so perhaps a lot of these species of what we call dinosaurs had died off before that point. But if there were some that existed, I believe it would have fallen into the requirement for Job to acquire animals for the ark. It did say of every kind of animal. But what makes us think that we're trying to put a full-grown adult Brachiosaurus onto the ark? That doesn't make much sense. Like we said when we saw Jurassic Park, you're not going to fit, more than one of those. You may not fit one on a big boat. But babies, they're a lot easier to come by. They're a lot smaller. They require less food and less cleanup after. And so we could imagine that if we chose a younger version of some of these things, perhaps there would be a little bit more room to go around. There's no reason to take an adult version of these things. All in all, we stand with the Bible stands, and there is not a clear contradiction between true evidence and what the Bible teaches us. We're going to stand with the Bible. Another point of debate is vestigial structures. So vestigial structures, in the same way that evolution builds on itself piece by piece, and of course imagine quotation marks up here, I'm talking for evolution as if it was true, all of it. Let's say that all of evolution was true. The way that it works is it builds on itself piece by piece. The good ideas are retained and passed down to the next generation. The bad ideas get thrown away, right? So the idea is that once something has evolved to a certain point to where it no longer needs something it used to have, well, that thing starts to shrivel up and disappear. Now, you'll see diagrams like this. If you look to your bottom left, and some of this is kind of funny too. It's really these comparisons are forced. They claim that they have no function or a diminishing function. There's no real true reason for them to exist, and they're withering away and they're disappearing. So if you look to the far right, you see a lizard. That's the modern day, everything there. A hip bone, leg bone, and toes. And then on the whale, if you zoom in real close, there's the hip bone and leg bone of the whale. And then the snake has two little bone dots. That's the hip bones and leg bones of the snake. So you can see how to try to say that those little structures are the same thing as the hip bone and leg bone on the chameleon. Well, that's a bit of a stretch to make that conclusion. There's little dots of bone on the snake. And then also to say that they have no function, well, that's incorrect as well. We know in those bones that they're referring to on the whale, they're used for procreation, and that was same with the snake. The coccyx, you'll see towards the bottom right, the coccyx on us, they claim is the residual of our tail as a monkey. It has no function, or not really any function. It's just the leftovers that's starting to wither away and die from generation to generation. It's going to disappear. Well, as it turns out, that coccyx is the base of a lot of tendons and ligaments that we need to move around properly. And without it, we wouldn't move around properly. Matter of fact, I would challenge anyone who believed that that is a vestigial structure to have it removed and see how life goes for you after that. It is a needful thing. It is there for a reason, and it does have a function. It is not the leftovers. It's something that we use. It's an anchor point for a lot of things. Same thing with the appendix. They say, well, there's a version of the appendix in predecessors to our species that was bigger and it had more functions in digestion. It's connected to the intestines. Certainly, it should have been involved in digestion. When we used to eat roots and stuff like that, it is no longer necessary because we have a different diet. It's starting to shrivel up and disappear. Well, our appendix does have function. It's involved in the immune system, taking samplings of what we have digested and introducing that to our immune system so that we can fight against things that are contaminants or bacteria or viruses, things like that, get a head start on some of those things. So it does have a very important function. There is a reason why it's there. It's not the leftovers from something we no longer need. This is a design function. Now, if some of these things have some commonality amongst them as far as where they're located, what they look like, even in their function, if there is some commonality there, then we can say certainly that is also a viable explanation for a common designer as opposed to the remnants of something that's no longer needed. And lastly, we're going to talk about the geologic column. Now, I'm sure at some point in school you've seen this where you have these different strata. They have different names, and then you can find different fossils in the different layers of the different strata. Well, the interesting thing about, well, let me go ahead and read my slide here. The rock layers contain fossils, are the observations. The conclusions is that the layers refer to the progression of time, and then the different fossils that you find in those different layers are from older and older and older, longer and longer ago. So one thing that I want to make sure that we're aware of, when we see this in the book, we see, we think of layers like at the Grand Canyon with layers of ground, and we think that somewhere they're saying that there's a place where you dig down a little bit and you're in this strata and you find these bones, and you dig down a little further and you find these bones, and you dig down a little further and you find these bones. That doesn't exist. That has never existed. We don't take one spot and you dig down some and you find a predictable set of fossils for a predictable strata. That doesn't happen. So how do they develop the organization of this geologic column? Well, what they do is they go digging somewhere and they find a fossil. And they say, well, I wonder what strata this fossil's in, because we're on the surface and you can have erosion wearing away strata level. So when you're on the ground at first, in a place, you don't necessarily know what strata you're in, all right? So you don't know what age you're standing in. It's not necessarily the modern age because it can be worn away. That's how we find, because if all the fossils were deep, deep, deep down in strata, how would we ever find them on the surface? Well, we do. We find them on the surface sometimes. We're not far below the surface. So somebody finds some fossils near the surface of the ground when they're digging, putting in a foundation of a house or something like that. They find some fossils on, a little under the crust, under the topsoil. And they say, I wonder what strata we're standing in right now, because obviously it's not, the newest strata, because I'm finding fossils here. So I wonder what strata we're standing in. And so they'll identify what type of fossil they're looking at. And he said, oh, this fossil is normally found in this so-and-so strata. So that must be how old it is. So this is the strata that we're standing in. So if we find anything else here, then it belongs to this time frame. Okay. Well, how did they know how old the fossil was? Well, if you're reading science books, the best way to know how old a fossil is what strata it's found in. Now, if you catch, there's something funny here. How do you identify how old the strata is, or which strata you're in, by the fossil you find in it? How do you know how old the fossil is? By what strata it's found in. A circular logic. It doesn't make any sense. You're using itself to date itself. But they don't find layer after layer after layer, fossil after fossil after fossil in a predictable pattern. That's not what they see. They find a fossil. Based off the fossil they find, they say it's this layer. If they find any other fossils in the direct vicinity, they say it belongs to that time group. Then they go somewhere else and say, oh, I found a different fossil that's older. This must be a deeper strata. This must be from this age. What I'm saying is you don't have this predictably stacked way. This doesn't exist. You find a fossil on the surface, you try to predict what strata it's in, and you make a claim that the fossil is this old, the strata is this old. Anything we find in the vicinity is going to be that same age. You go somewhere else, you make a claim based off what you find there if it's a newer or older layer. It's not particularly trustworthy method. Like I said, it's using circular reasoning to determine where you're at in the strata anytime you find something there near the surface. as far as the layers we talked about in that little experiment, we can see that with a large flood, some of this can be explained. Why do we still, we find a certain, regardless of how they say they discovered how old this strata is, you find fossils, you do tend to find the same type of fossils together in the same layer. We don't really have a good way of dating those layers. We talked about the dating methods and the assumptions that are inherent there. But these different fossils still are found in a relatively predictable way together. Why is that? Why could we find these fossils in these different layers? Well, organisms, just like the material that they're in, mixed all up together in something like a large flood, are going to separate by densities. And it's funny that we tend to find things that are more dense in lower strata, like trilobites. Trilobites are all shell, and a little bit of meat there, but mostly shell. We find those at the bottom strata typically, right? Deeper, that you find them. Like I said, the geologic column doesn't really work the way like it appears to work in the textbooks. Nevertheless, we could see how there can be some layering in the way things lay out, the way these biomasses of coal and oil form, the way these strata develop in the land, all based off of a large flood, and it's sorting things by settling out and densities. The Cambrian explosion. This is a section similar we talked about where they couldn't say things were moving little bit by little bit through speciation, that they must have all been evolved very quickly over a short period of time. Spontaneous equilibrium was the term for that. The Cambrian explosion is very similar. It's the idea that for a long time you have a lot of dirt down there. It doesn't have anything in it, no fossils in that dirt. And then all of a sudden you have everything close together, very little separation between layers. A lot of dirt, no fossils, and then you have dirt that's got a lot of fossils in it. Well, to me that sounds like settling out of densities. But their claim their explanation for that separation is the Cambrian explosion, that these, stuff like trilobites, which are on the bottom, which are dense, similar to the material they're found in, that from that there was nothing for a long time, and then all of a sudden there was an explosion of the spontaneous equilibrium, the very strong evolutionary pressure and the very rapid expansion of species. Finally, polystriate fossils. This is very interesting. When we're talking about layers and dating the layers, if we were to assume that all these layers represent time, going back in time, going through the layers, then what sense does this make? We find all the time trees and different materials found that cross the layers, that cross the strata, polystrat fossils. We saw a lot of this around Mount St. Helens. There was a lake at the base of Mount St. Helens, and when all those trees got pushed down with the mudslides into that lake, and then all that material, the mud and stuff, and all, it made a real big slushy of material, which eventually dried out with evaporation, and it was all left in there, that material that had been mixed up with water. And guess what they found? It started making layers. So when they cut into these layers, they're finding trees and stuff fossilized that cross these layers. Now they say obviously these layers are not due to time, they're due to the separation of densities from the mixing that happened during the volcanic eruption, and they would be correct. And I would go so far as to say that's the explanation for a lot of the layers that we have due to a very big flood, same kind of causation. So it can be identified in a small subsetting, but they want to apply a different logic to a more grand scale. But we find fossilized trees, fossilized things that cross these strata. So how could one part of the tree be millions of years older than the other part of the tree? That just doesn't make any sense, as we can see. So that's a shot against the geologic column and the assertion that the layers are a representation of time. Of course, as we talked about with all clocks when we were discussing time as a point of debate, there are those three assumptions that are problematic: whether or not you know the original conditions, whether the rate is inherently constant, and whether or not it has or can ever be affected by an outside force. So That is concluding this section of this series. Hopefully we will have some questions and comments to address. So much appreciate you joining me for this series, and perhaps we will see each other next week. Thank you.